Okay, good afternoon. I'm here to talk to you today about the Fit for Birth study, which took place at Liverpool Women's Hospital, which was it was set out to be a longitudinal observational cohort study, which was basically designed to kind of examine the normal patterns of weight gain in pregnant women. And the aims of it were to generate data, generate information in order to take it further to, generate new ideas for research and plan further research. So there was two arms to the study. The first one being women with a BMI of 30 and over were invited to have their weights recorded at their usual routine antenatal clinics, and then they would just have that recorded, but as I say, at those particular points in time. And then there was a further subset of the study which looked at women with a BMI of 35 and over, and the inclusion criteria for that were that they had a BMI of 35 and over at booking in, over 18 years of age, and it was a singleton pregnancy. Obviously, the whole point about weight in pregnancy is, and obesity in pregnancy stems from obviously lifestyle factors. So I was just going to give you a little bit of a background or some kind of research that I generated from a qualitative study that I did beyond this, but it actually gives a little bit of background. So we're looking at pregnancy as the optimum time to sort of possibly intervene in terms of diet because of this inter-utero programming. There are lots of factors that relate to obesity during the lifespan, and these occur during infancy, preschool feeding, adolescence, society, environmental media influences, transitional influences, which I'm just going to talk to you briefly about in the next slide, and then up to when, as and when these women become pregnant themselves. What I gathered from the talks that I had with these women were that there are lots and lots of transitional phases during the lifespan that actually contributed to obesity. And the influences that they had were in relationships with work, social and cultural, environmental influences, obviously we live in an obesogenic society, media influences, a lot of peer pressure, media pressure, their own perceptions of their weight. Very often young adolescent girls think they're overweight when they're not. It's just part of the maturation process. And then obviously their own health as well. And then they go through these transitional stages as a result of some of these influences, and even becoming autonomous, where they're becoming financially self-sufficient, so they start changing lifestyle, behaviours. Food choices can change, particularly when they get a new partnership. Their body shape changes again during maturation. Physical well-being and pregnancy obviously is a massive, massive transitional change, which very often contributes to obesity. And very often they feel of this loss of control as a result of some of these transitional changes, and their lifestyles can change, their weight changes, their diets change. Time becomes a major factor. They have no time to devote to reducing their weight, or they have the young children running around, and of course their health changes. And all these have negative impacts on them, with psychological well-being being one of them. They suffer from terrible guilt, depression, anxiety, etc., etc. This can lead to a physiological response to stress because of the stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, etc. And these factors can actually be a barrier to change, as well as a driver to change as well, because it just depends on the psychological well-being of the woman at a given point in time. But going back to the pregnancy, obviously obesity itself poses many risk factors for these women. Gestational diabetes, the predisposition to type 2 diabetes, hypertensive disorders, increased risk of caesarean section, a whole host of risk factors, as well as fetal risks as well, in terms of macrosomia, shoulder dystocia, intrauterine growth restriction, etc. And these are in the sort of short term. But what I wanted to sort of talk to you a little bit about was possibly the long-term effects of obesity in pregnancy, and the dietary intake of these women that can possibly predispose their offspring to long-term disease risks. So epigenetics, I'm sure you've all heard of the term. It's basically where the components in diet can affect gene expression, changing the sort of the potential phenotype, and this in response to obviously environmental stimuli. Predictive adaptive response is something that they was essentially a survival tool. Essentially, it would pre-program babies in uteri in order to adapt them to life beyond the uterus. But of course, possibly the environment that they're born into is not always necessarily advantageous to the phenotype that was possibly potentially programmed into them, and this leads on to disease then. So it forms the basis of the Barker hypothesis and the origins of adult disease. So where do nutrients come into that? Well, the micronutrients that that I've kind of studied, particularly in relation to diet and the dietary intakes of these pregnant women, these are the reference nutrient intakes that are recommended for women during pregnancy. But these recommendations are based on normal distribution and normal weight. And it's been sort of shown that obese women have lower circulating or lower concentrations of these macronutrients in plasma. And of course, some of the deficiencies that are related to micronutrient deficiencies are calcium is associated with hypertensive disorders and preeclampsia. Iron is increased risk for preterm birth, low birth weight babies, which then has an influence on metabolic syndrome and obesity in later life. And iodine has increased risk for cretinism in offspring and deficits in intellectual motor function, etc. Excuse me. Vitamin D is a really important one. There's lots of research going on vitamin D at the moment, but its primary kind of function is essential for calcium homeostasis, but it's also implicated in gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and an increased risk for emergency caesarean section. Also leads on to potential insulin resistance and therefore metabolic syndrome, which then predisposes these women and offspring to type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Folate is folic acid is recommended prior to conception in order to reduce the incidence of neural tube defects. But also, folate itself is still recommended because folate is related to homocysteine levels and has an inverse relationship. So therefore, low folate intake is related to higher homocysteine concentrations, which then is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. So that's the kind of sort of background to it. I was the research nutritionist on the study, and I sent out 3 food day diaries to the women prior to 16 weeks, 28 and 36 weeks appointments. They came to visit me. We went through the diaries step by step, so there was a follow-up interview to validate the kind of diaries and estimate food portion sizes. And we used food atlases in order to estimate food portion sizes. And then I used supermarket websites to kind of determine nutritional values of composite foods and ready-made things. So it's a bit of a busy slide, this, but in the first column, if you look down, the macronutrient profile is sort of representative of what you would expect. So carbohydrate, their actual energy intake was kind of commensurate with the recommendations, estimated average requirements. And their protein, or the carbohydrate, is sort of a ratio of carbohydrate intake, protein intake. It reflects what the recommendations are. Non-starch polysaccharide actually is considerably low throughout, but it remains sort of fairly consistent. Saturated fatty acid is a little bit above and actually increases over time, and the same with mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And then the PS ratio, which looks at ratio of polyunsaturated fatty acids to saturated fatty acids, is actually below what the recommendation is. Average is round about 0.45, but I think they'd rather have a ratio of about 0.8 to 1. What this means in terms of how these women, their dietary intake, converting it into a proportion of their actual dietary intake, you can see that over time there's an increase in energy intake of 11.5%, and also an increase in all the fatty acid intakes as well. So total fat goes up by 9.5, but as a percentage of that, 12.5 of that is 12.5% increase in saturated fatty intake. When you look at it as a ratio of dietary intake, the non-starch polysaccharide goes down by 9.8% when it's looked as a proportion of energy. And also the starch actually reduces as well. And the same with the micronutrient intakes. These are the average mean intakes. It's very busy slides, but I'll just show you this one because, again, I want you to sort of have a look at the percentage change at the bottom, which is a proportion of the overall energy. So it's a proportion of the per megajoule actually decreases. So calcium goes down by about 17.1%. Vitamin D, notoriously difficult to derive from dietary sources, I know, but that went down by 27%. Iron by 10%, folate by 26%, and iodine by 6%. So the take-home message is that the diet actually deteriorates over time, suggesting that they're getting their requisite amount of energy, so that it's energy dense but nutrient poor. I did take into account misreporting. We did look at, and it reflects a sort of normal amount, but if you taken into account underreporting actually dilutes this macronutrient intake even further. So if you're looking at perhaps adding on about 30% in calories, the likelihood is that they're going to derive these calories from energy dense and nutrient poor food. So it's diluting these macronutrient intakes even further. But at the end of this, because of the energy intakes overall were kind of commensurate with the estimated average requirements. The weight distribution was kind of, in the women that we actually had weights for in this subset of women, was fairly kind of equal across the board. So less than, probably 60, between 60 and 70% actually limited their weight gain to sort of below IOM recommendations. And only a small proportion of them actually gained in excess of the IOM recommendations. So obviously they weren't necessarily gaining weight, but they weren't actually consuming a very sort of nutrient-rich diet. The subset of women between 35 and 39 BMI, 40 BMI, they were the ones that gained the most weight. They had higher increases in total energy consumption and proportionally had the highest incidences of hypertension, preeclampsia, etc., etc. What this means, obviously, this feeds through into practice. So the idea is that women are meant to receive additional guidance with a BMI of over 30, but in practice it's possibly 40 and over before they're receiving sort of bariatric care. So there's potential risks for women in this particular bracket. So again, as I say, there's quality of diet had deteriorated. There were some links between calorie intake and low birth weight. It's quite modest. The actual subset of women was quite small, so it would benefit from actually doing this on a much larger scale. Again, there's no current guidelines for weight gain in the UK. There's a positive correlation between weight gain and postpartum retention, which compounds the situation further. What I'd like to leave you with, though, is this kind of question. There is a lot of emphasis on weight management in the obese population, and there's there's insufficient emphasis on health and food quality. And my question would be, would women respond more positively to a change in emphasis away from weight and possibly more onto health, given that women have very negative kind of connotations with their own weight. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.